Hey, everybody. Welcome to our first ever Medics Underground recording. The Medics Underground is a project put on by a group of medics who just want to get out better education. And we're going to do this through a variety of ways with case studies, journal reviews, things of that nature. As always, at the end, there'll be an email address to reach out to us if you want specific content or specific subject to be covered. Our goal ultimately is to fill the gaps that we're not getting on our day-to-day EMS educations, because we're locked into that EMS national registry cycle, or we're dictated what we want to learn about, and that's not always what we want to learn. So at the end of this, feel free to reach out to us and we'll add whatever content you like. But for today, this is going to be part of a recurring series called Tox Talk. And what this is going to be is various toxidromes or toxicological syndromes, things like that, how to recognize them, how to treat them, why they affect the body the way they do. So for episode 1, we're going to call this The Fallen Good Samaritan. So here's your scene. 37-year-old male is first on scene of a residential structure fire at his neighbor's house. He heard a dog barking inside and made entry prior to any fire or law enforcement arrival. FD arrives on scene to see an open front door with heavy black smoke coming out of the doorway. An initial primary search pulls the male victim, who is found on the ground only a few feet inside the structure. Now he's brought out to you. And here's where our case begins. Your initial assessment, obviously after you've removed the clothing that's charred and have viewed your patient, your head to toe, you've got minor burns to the exposed skin. We'll call them first degree. Your airway, open. Some soot noted around the nares. No apparent airway burns, though. Breathing, it's agonal. It's not great at a rate of about 6 per minute. Circulation, you've got a thready pulse rate at about 110 beats a minute. When you look at your AVPU, alert, verbal, painful, unresponsive, he is unresponsive. And pupils are dilated and sluggish to respond. All right. So now we've got our secondary. Your vitals, blood pressure is 88/56, heart rate 110, sinus tach on your monitor, breathing, still 6 a minute and shallow. Pulse ox, 91% on room air, GCS of 7. No further trauma is found on your exam, only about 12% body surface area of first degree burns noted on the arms and hands. Airway remains patent. So now the big question, what now? What are we thinking? What are your initial concerns as medics or EMTs? Are you worried about burns? Are you worried about trauma? Are you worried about the airway? Are you worried about hemodynamic instability? Smoke inhalation? All these thoughts should be running through your heads. What are your first treatments going to be? The obvious, the big ones are, airway. Get it in a hold of maybe not through an advanced procedure, but it's through, control of that airway through a BVM. Help that respiratory drive get going. And what's your mechanism of injury and illness? Do you find this to be predominantly a trauma, burn-related issue? Do you find it to be a medical issue due to some sort of medical issue going on? Here's a hint. This is a toxidrome lecture, so strong possibility of that. Or is it a combination? Can it be a combination? We're often taught things are black and white, but we live in a world of gray. Can this be many things happening at the same time? So this is where we're going to take our first little stroll down toxidrome lane. And one of the things you should be considering is HCN, hydrogen cyanide. It's a product of incomplete combustion from urethanes, wools, nylons, PVCs, plastics, which are ubiquitous in our day-to-day lives and it's definitely prevalent in our modern structure fires. Gone are the days of all furniture being wood and cloth. Now everything has got plastics in it. So it's a byproduct of that. It's usually colorless. It's got an odor of bitter almonds, though there's a percentage of the population that can't smell that smell, so it's not reliable. And it's IDLH at only 50 parts per million. And for my fire folks in here, you can have normal readings on your 3-gas or 4-gas detector and still have 50 parts per million present in the atmosphere. So knowing this was Was this something that was in your mind already when we started this lecture? Is this something you've encountered? Or is this something unique as it's been rearing its ugly head to us in the fire service, especially more and more recently? So here's where we're going to deep dive into some physiology here for just a minute or two. Overwhelmingly, these lectures will be operational in nature and really teaching you how to apply what we're teaching to your medicine every day. But I'd be remiss if I didn't touch a little bit on the physiology of how hydrogen cyanide is going to affect your cells. Within the mitochondria and the cells, there exists an electron chain that separates its inner and outer membranes. Electrons move across this from left to right, allowing the movement of hydrogen ions into and out of the mitochondria, and this allows for cellular metabolism and ATP creation, the foundations of life. Numerous agents are included in this chain, but one of the final is cytochrome C oxidase, and this is really important. Once hydrogen cyanide enters the cell, it has a high affinity for the ferric iron within it, and this binding of cyanide and the ferric iron in the cytochrome C oxidase interrupts the electron transport chain within the mitochondria. Therefore, it's inhibiting the production of ATP, and this causes cellular dysfunction and possible cellular necrosis. So now this is a toxidrome lecture. What's the toxidrome? How is it going to affect our body? Its primary effects are found in the central nervous system and the cardiovascular system, and this is due to the decrease in aerobic metabolism. Remember that ATP production. It's also noted that this is a systemic asphyxiant, meaning if we don't fix this, we can pump all the oxygen we want into this patient. It's not going to get to them because it's systemically affecting on a cellular level how they're able to perfuse and get oxygen exchange. It's also noted this is highly water-soluble irritant gas, and that's more for my hazmat guys who really want to talk about how to knock it down in an environment. So how do these symptoms manifest? How do I visually see on my patient through signs and symptoms what's going on when they have a hydrogen cyanide toxicity? Well, it starts with mild nausea, dizziness, drowsiness. That can increase to more moderate, brief loss of consciousness, some vomiting, maybe a seizure, and severe coma, dilated non-reactive pupils, and finally cardiac arrest. And many things can affect mild, moderate, or severe. How big is the patient? How much have they breathed in? A child versus an adult. What's the concentration of hydrogen cyanide? Did this patient walk inside this structure fire door, take a deep breath of some hydrogen cyanide and hit the deck? Is that what occurred? These are all questions you have to ask yourself because this is a complicated and rarely straightforward process. So once we think we've recognized this might be a hydrogen cyanide toxicity, let's talk treatment. First and foremost, high flow O2, assist in ventilations. But remember that, systemic asphyxiant effect. We have to fix how this happens, fix on a cellular level so our cells can get that oxygen again. And this is going to be the cyanokit. Back in the day, there used to be things such as amyl nitrate and sodium thiosulfate. We've moved away from those drugs because they can tend to be more dangerous and have to be dosed extremely appropriately, where you can have negative effects. Versus the cyanokit, hydroxycobalamin, it's 5 grams given IV or IO. And guess what? The vial itself is a 5-gram dose. So the dose is the vial. And that kit comes with its own 2 vials, one of powder, one of liquid, makes it much like we think of glucogen, how we would do that. Comes with its own line. And what's important to know here is this needs its own dedicated IV or IO. This can't be mixed with other fluids or drugs. This needs to have its own dedicated line. So now we've got the kit. How is it working? How, is it affecting my patient? What is it doing to them? Well, the cyanokit's mechanism lies in its primary ingredient, hydroxycobalamin. This is the cobalt atom within it that directly binds with the cyanide anion, and this displaces a hydroxide anion, forming a non-toxic cyanocobalamin. You might recognize this if anybody drinks Monsters or Rock Stars or Red Bulls as vitamin B12. This is then excreted through the urine. So what this does is this binds on a cellular level with what's causing the problem and turns it into B12, which they excrete through the urine. Incredibly safe. How safe is it? Well, here are the indications for it. Anytime you have suspected cyanide toxicity, which would be the following: exposure to fire or smoke in an enclosed area, any soot around the nose, mouth, or back of the mouth. And then accompanying this, any altered mental status or unresponsiveness. So the indications are pretty broad and pretty easy. There aren't a ton of contraindications to this. In fact, the only contraindication is known hypersensitivity or allergy, which, how are we going to know that unless they've gotten this drug before? Also, think about the necessity of this drug. This isn't one we're just going to hold off on, debate, well, maybe they're sensitive to it or not. No, this is something they definitely need to be given. So I've said it's incredibly safe to give, and we've given it. What can we expect as a side effect? They're actually pretty minimal when you consider it. At the end of the day, here the biggest side effects found is chromaturia, and this is 100% of patients. This is a reddish-brown urine color, which, as we talked about earlier, on a physiological level, this is how all the bad stuff's being excreted through the urine. So that's an 100%, so they can expect that. Reddish-brown skin discoloration that is self-resolving, meaning nothing has to be done with it. That's present in 94% of patients. And oftentimes there's a transient self-resolving elevated blood pressure, and this is about 18% of patients. But if you think about it, this is a good thing because it can cause hypotension. If you think back to our case study a few minutes ago, that patient was hypotensive. This could actually be beneficial to them. All right, time for a clinical update. Back to our patient we've been working on. So we're going to say you've been bagging the patient, you've got good high flow O2 going, you've got a line established, you've done all that. You gave the cyanokit. You didn't notice any significant change in mental status. However, you noticed the BP did bump up to 110/82. So now you've gotten a slightly better BP. The remainder of the vitals remain relatively unchanged. So what else could be the culprit? What else are we thinking? That it wasn't HCN solely, which, do we expect that? The product, the toxic byproducts of structure fires these days, the toxic gases list in the numbers in hundreds of toxic gases. So what else could we be thinking? What else is going on? What do we need to adjust? Remember, thinking back, because this is a toxidrome lecture, what other toxidrome can we think about? If you said CO or carbon monoxide, you'd be right. This is a byproduct of incomplete combustion. This is what we find at structure fires or in homes when cars are left running in the garage. And, it's super dangerous because it's colorless. It's odorless. People don't know they're being exposed to it. This is why you hear about every year people leave their car in the garage by accident, especially with the new push starts that don't require the key coming in and out, and go to bed and they never wake up. It's because that gas permeates the house and they don't know it because they can't smell it. And it's, becomes an IDLH environment at 1,200 parts per million, which is substantially higher than hydrogen cyanide, but it's still relatively low when you think about readings on gas meters and how much oxygen displacement has to take place for that to occur. So what are CO's effects on the cell itself? Well, it binds with the oxygen binding sites in hemoglobin molecules within the red blood cells, and this creates carboxyhemoglobin. And this decreases the red blood cell's ability to transport oxygen. Furthermore, when carbon monoxide binds to any of the oxygen binding sites in a hemoglobin molecule, the oxygen molecule already bound to that hemoglobin become bound more tightly and are less likely to release into the body's tissues. CO also binds with cytochrome C oxidase. If you remember, so does our hydrogen cyanide. And this inhibits aerobic metabolism. These effects, though, they're minimal when you compare it to the fact that it's loss of oxygen transport inhibition by the creation of carboxyhemoglobin. So let's look at the comparison of hydrogen cyanide and CO on the body. And if you look, there is quite a bit of crossover between what happens during an HCN toxicity and a carbon monoxide toxicity. Common to both: headaches, nausea, vomiting, confusion, dyspnea, coma, seizures. So I would present this to you that Anytime you encounter a patient with any of those symptoms who's been exposed to products of incomplete combustion in a confined space, so in a structure fire in some sort of a fire environment, we should just assume that they're suffering from both in this modern era, with the prevalence of PVCs and plastics within our structure fire environments. And we need to treat them both as such. And when we're talking about the treatment crossover, for hydrogen cyanide, it's important to get that cyano kit on board. But the treatment for both is going to be high flow O2. The half-life of carboxyhemoglobin on room air is 4.5 hours. So if we just sit around breathing the normal 20.9% oxygen that's present in our environment, it takes 4.5 hours for that to clear. If I put you on 100% FiO2, so a non-rebreather or a CPAP style machine at 100%, that'd get you about 1.5 hours. But if I put you in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, that's at about a half hour. So it's important to know in your area who has hyperbaric capabilities, and not just hyperbaric, but interventional hyperbaric capabilities. Lots of hospitals maintain those machines for things of wound management and other inpatient things like that, but very, very few actually have interventional hyperbaric therapy that's available at the drop of a hat, or when you need it, when you make that call, are they available? So that's something to scout out ahead of time with your EMS division and to possibly write into your protocols. So you transition your patient to a hospital. They're doing better after the cyano kit and high flow O2, but they're going to require long-term care and some more treatments such as hyperbaric therapy. It's important to talk about this in regards to firemen too. So this is out of Providence, Rhode Island. During a 24-hour period, they fought 3 separate structure fires. These are the same crews, mind you. One of the firefighters was diagnosed with hydrogen cyanide poisoning after one of the fires. A second firefighter went into cardiac arrest and was found to be hydrogen cyanide toxic. And then of the 27 remaining firefighters that they tested out of caution, 8 had significant levels of hydrogen cyanide within their body. So if you look at that, that's about 30 people and 11 of them had issues. That's a third of the firefighters had significant hydrogen cyanide concerns, which means they probably also had significant CO concerns. I don't know the backstory on this exactly. I don't know if they weren't compliant with their masks, if they were doing overhaul without clearing the area with gas meters. But it's just one of those takeaways for our fire guys. We need to pay attention when we're doing these things, and we need to be safe about it so that a third of our crews don't go down with toxicity. All right. So let's talk our takeaways from this lecture. There can be multiple toxicological effects present on a patient. Not every toxidrome or exposure is just single in nature. And remember, just because you're ventilating doesn't mean you're oxygenating. So remember that cytochrome C oxidase and the carboxyhemoglobin. And just because you're pushing O2 into these patients doesn't mean necessarily that they're getting it on a cellular level. Establish multiple access points if possible for your IVs. So that's in regards to the cyano kit. You need a dedicated line for that. So you want to get bilaterals or an IO. Never rule out the IO. It's an incredibly important tool in our tool bag. Don't ever get pulled down the trauma, / burn rabbit hole. So just because this patient has some burns, that's why I made them first degree. So it was relatively minor, as to not draw you too far, put those blinders on. But remember, the trauma can be caused secondary to the toxidromic effects. And it's worth reminding, since we're just briefly touching burns at the end here, we will have a burn lecture in the future. The new ABA recommendations for fluids, the Parkland formula is gone. We're talking minimal fluids and burns. So for 14 and older, 500 milliliters of lactated ringers over an hour. That's not a bolus, that's over an hour. 6 to 13 is half of that. And then under 6 is going to be half of that. So remember, we're talking minimal fluid dosages these days, people. When in doubt, maybe give almost nothing if you can. It's better to under fluid resuscitate than over fluid resuscitate or burn patients. All right. I hope you guys took something away from this. This was our first ever lecture for Medics Underground. We have numerous lecturers. I'm Brad. And, if you have recommendations, this is going to be a site driven by those who come to it. So if you have a topic you want to learn about using updated, clinically driven, evidence-based medicine, let us know. We'll do the research and we'll put out these 15 to 20-minute talks. And in the future, you can expect to hopefully get CEs for this. But until then, hope you all learned something and look forward to hearing from you.